A squad is pinned in a valley in Afghanistan, taking fire from a ridgeline 400 meters out. Every carbine in the platoon can reach that ridge. Reach was never the problem. The problem is everything past reach. At that distance, with wind pulling at a smaller, lighter round and a partly exposed shooter using the terrain to stay hidden, putting a bullet exactly where it needs to go stops being a sure thing. Then, a designated marksman shoulders something heavier, chambered in a cartridge that was already considered too big, too heavy, and too old-fashioned when the war in Vietnam was still going on. The range stops being a problem the way it was a minute ago. The rifle in his hands began losing its job as America's standard infantry weapon in the mid-1960s. The Army spent years transitioning away from it, retired it from general service, and built an entire replacement rifle specifically to correct what planners saw as its shortcomings. A lighter weapon, an easier round to control, a design built around the close, fast infantry combat the next generation of war was expected to bring. And yet decades later, that same retired design was being pulled out of storage, rebuilt from the frame up, and issued back to combat units because the rifle that replaced it couldn't do something the battlefield had started demanding again. That's not a story about the Army admitting it made a mistake. It's not a story about institutional stubbornness or nostalgia for an older, simpler weapon. It's a story about a battlefield changing shape in a way nobody fully saw coming, and an old rifle turning out to be exactly what that new shape called for. Most people who know anything about the M14 know how its story is supposed to end. Standardized in 1957 and widely issued to troops beginning around 1960, chambered in the full-power 7.62 x 51 NATO round, it was meant to replace a whole cluster of older weapons. Among them, the M1 rifle, the M2 carbine, the M3 submachine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle, with a single common rifle and cartridge that could serve as both a standard infantry weapon and an automatic rifle. It was already being displaced by the M16 family by the middle of the following decade. The M16 was lighter, fired a smaller round that let a soldier carry more ammunition, and controlled far better in automatic fire. All real, well-documented advantages that made it a genuinely better general-purpose infantry rifle for most of what a rifleman actually does in combat. By the mid-1960s, the M14 was being phased out of frontline service, replaced across nearly every unit that had carried it, and the story most people know stops right there. Better rifle wins, older rifle loses. Case closed. That's a reasonable place to expect the story to end. Most weapons that lose a head-to-head competition against their own successor stay lost. It's also not where the M14 story actually ends. And the reason why has less to do with anyone regretting the decision to replace it than with what the next several decades of combat turned out to actually look like. The M16 solved real problems, and it's worth being honest about that before explaining why the M14 kept coming back anyway. A lighter rifle meant a soldier could carry more rounds for the same weight, which mattered enormously to a rifleman who might need to fight for hours without resupply. A smaller round meant less recoil, faster follow-up shots, and vastly better control on full automatic. A Marine or soldier laying down suppressive fire with an M16 could keep rounds on target in a way the M14's punishing recoil in automatic mode never really allowed. Those were genuine advances, and for the kind of close, fast-moving infantry combat the US military expected to fight for most of the back half of the 20th century, the trade-offs clearly favored the M16 and the 5.56 round it fired. But every one of those advantages came from the same basic decision: trade power and reach for weight and control. A 7.62 round generally retains more energy at extended range and is less affected by wind than the smaller 5.56 round. But it also comes with heavier ammunition and recoil that makes it harder to control, especially on automatic. For decades, that trade-off barely mattered, because the wars the US military was fighting, or preparing to fight, rarely demanded rifle engagements much past 200 or 300 meters. Dense jungle, close European terrain, urban combat measured in city blocks rather than open valleys. None of it especially rewarded a rifle built to reach out past 500 meters and still perform well when it got there. The advantage wasn't that the 5.56 round suddenly became useless at distance. It was that the 7.62 round gave a trained marksman a bigger performance margin as range opened up. And for most of the Cold War, nobody needed that margin. The M16's trade-offs were real, on paper, from the day it was adopted. They just weren't relevant to the fights actually happening, which is a very different thing from not existing at all. That changed the moment American forces found themselves fighting in terrain that put real distance back on the table, in a way nobody planning small arms procurement in the 1960s had specifically prepared for. Afghanistan didn't just test the M16 and its shorter-barreled M4 variant. It exposed a gap nobody had been planning around. A widely cited 2009 Army monograph, drawing on comments from soldiers and officers returning from theater, found that roughly half of small arms engagements were happening beyond 300 meters, in wide valleys and along distant ridge lines, where insurgents had every incentive to open fire from as far away as possible, use heavier weapons to do real damage, and withdraw before American air support or artillery could respond. Its author argued that American equipment, training, and doctrine had been optimized for engagements under 300 meters, on relatively level terrain, not for the half-kilometer fights Afghanistan kept producing. At those distances, a standard 5.56 round loses much of the performance margin that made it so effective up close. And American squads were finding themselves outranged by their own attackers, in a war where the terrain itself handed the advantage to whoever could shoot farthest. An insurgent with an old bolt-action rifle or a machine gun perched on a ridge could pin down an entire patrol simply by staying outside the range where American rifles could effectively answer back. That gap had real tactical consequences beyond simple frustration. A squad that couldn't return effective fire at the range it was being engaged from had exactly two options: call for air support or artillery, and wait, giving the enemy time to disengage and vanish into terrain that had sheltered fighters for generations. Or close the distance under fire, trading the safety of range for the ability to actually shoot back. Neither option was good, and both cost time, exposure, and occasionally lives that a rifle capable of reaching out to the same distance the enemy was shooting from could have saved outright. Commanders who'd spent careers training for engagements measured in tens of meters were suddenly relearning lessons about range that hadn't mattered to American infantry doctrine since well before Vietnam. Iraq presented a related but different version of the same problem. Fighting there moved constantly between confined urban spaces, long straight roads, rooftops, and more open terrain on the outskirts of cities. Engagement distances that could stretch out far past what room-to-room doctrine had trained soldiers to expect. A semi-automatic rifle chambered for a heavier round gave designated marksmen more reach and more margin against distance and wind than a standard carbine offered, which mattered on those long city streets. What it didn't offer was some clean, universal edge at punching through walls and vehicles. How well any round performed against cover depended heavily on the specific ammunition design, not just the size of the cartridge. And by the time better engineered 5.56 rounds reached the field later in the war, some of them out-penetrated 7.62 ball ammunition against exactly the kind of hard cover troops were dealing with. The value the heavier rifle brought to Iraq was reach and precision at distance, not a barrier-busting advantage the round didn't actually have. Neither problem was something the M16 family had been designed to solve, because neither problem existed in the form planners expected when the M16 was adopted in the first place. The rifle that replaced the M14 was still, by any reasonable measure, the better general-purpose infantry weapon. It just wasn't built for the specific, narrower job that these two very different battlefields had started demanding at the same time. Long-range accuracy, paired with a round that hit hard enough, far enough, to matter. The military didn't need to invent a new rifle to answer that gap. It already had one sitting in storage, in armories and depots across the country, largely untouched since the 1960s. Naval special warfare got there first, and years before Afghanistan and Iraq made the need obvious to everyone else. Around the turn of the millennium, the Naval Surface Warfare Center at Crane, Indiana, drove development of the Mark 14 Mod 0 Enhanced Battle Rifle. Rebuilt M14 receivers dropped into a modern adjustable chassis with a telescoping stock, a pistol grip, and rails for optics and accessories. Everything the original 1959 design lacked, built around the same rotating bolt action and 7.62 chambering that had made the M14 a full-power rifle in the first place. Versions of the weapon went on to see use across American Special Operations units, the kind of units that had never fully stopped valuing the reach the M14's cartridge offered, even while the rest of the military moved on decades earlier. They were the operators most likely to run into exactly the kind of fight where the M14's reach still mattered, and they'd been pushing for a modernized version of it before the wider military had fully recognized the problem. By the mid-2000s, the Army and Marine Corps needed a version of the same solution at a much larger scale, and they built it the same way, by rebuilding the rifle they had already retired rather than designing something new from scratch. The Army's Enhanced Battle Rifle and the Marine Corps' M39 Enhanced Marksman's Rifle drew on the concepts and components pioneered at Crane, each fitted with a full-length barrel and modern furniture, giving designated marksmen the ability to engage targets at extended range with a rifle that could finally accept the same night vision, lasers, and optics every other weapon in a modern squad carried. The original M14's fixed wooden stock hadn't been built with body armor in mind either, and couldn't be adjusted to fit the length of pull a soldier needed once modern plate carriers changed how a rifle sat against the shoulder. Another real reason the rifle needed genuine modernization, not just a fresh coat of paint, before it could go back to war. Thousands of these rebuilt M14s made their way into Army and Marine Corps units over the years that followed, with the exact numbers and distribution varying by service, formation, and deployment. Instead of staying with dedicated sniper teams working apart from the unit, extended range capability moved much closer to ordinary infantry, squads and platoons, rather than specialists held in reserve. It was a real, if uneven, expansion of who in a unit could reach out past the standard rifle's comfortable range, built to give designated marksmen meaningfully better range and accuracy than a 5.56 carbine could offer. None of this made the M16 or M4 worse weapons at the job they were actually built for. It didn't need to. What it proved was that retiring a rifle from general service had never actually eliminated the specific battlefield role that rifle's cartridge was built to fill. That role had just gone quiet for a few decades, waiting for a war that needed it again. This wasn't the first time the M14 had been pulled back into service after supposedly being retired. In Vietnam, Accurized versions of the same rifle were already being issued as the M21 sniper system, in service from 1969 until it was replaced by a purpose-built bolt-action rifle in 1988. Proof that the specific combination of range, power, and accuracy the M14 offered had never actually stopped being useful, even during the war that was supposed to make it obsolete for good. What happened in Afghanistan and Iraq decades later was really a continuation of the same pattern, driven by a far bigger and more urgent version of the same underlying gap. Across two major eras, first as an M14-based sniper system during and after Vietnam, then as a designated marksman and enhanced battle rifle during the post-9/11 wars, the same basic action kept returning whenever American units needed more precision and reach than their standard rifles conveniently provided. Even after the Army eventually moved toward a newer, purpose-built rifle, the M110A1 Squad-Designated Marksman Rifle, based on an existing Heckler & Koch design, and fielded to units starting around 2020, the role itself never went anywhere. The military didn't conclude that designated marksmen carrying a harder-hitting round had been a mistake. It simply kept refining which specific rifle filled that role, while the requirement the M14 had answered stayed exactly as real as it had been the day the first enhanced battle rifles shipped out. The specific rifle changed hands more than once, from the original 1959 design to the Crane-built EBR to a newer, purpose-built platform decades later. The job it proved necessary never got retired again, and every rifle that has filled it since has had to prove itself against the same standard the M14 first re-established. Reach, power, and the ability to hit something a lighter rifle simply couldn't. That pattern is the real story here, more than any single rifle. Twice across more than 50 years, once during and after Vietnam, and again across the post-9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the American military found itself needing exactly what the M14's cartridge offered. In situations nobody had specifically designed the M16 family to handle. Each time, the fastest and most reliable answer wasn't a brand new weapon system. It was the same old rifle, modernized just enough to work in the field it had originally been retired from. The M14 didn't outlive the M16 because it was secretly the better rifle all along. In the role both were actually built for, a standard infantry weapon carried by every rifleman in a unit, fighting the close, fast engagements that defined most of the fighting the American military expected after Vietnam, the M16 family did its job better, and the US military's decision to make that switch in the 1960s held up for exactly the reasons planners expected it to. Nobody serious about the M14's history argues the Army should have kept it as the standard rifle. That argument would lose, the same way it lost the first time. What the M14 proved instead was narrower and, in its own way, more interesting. That replacing a rifle in its original role doesn't retire the specific combination of qualities that rifle happened to offer, and that a battlefield can change in ways that make yesterday's retired weapon exactly what tomorrow's fight requires. Nobody planning the M16's adoption in the early 1960s could have known that valleys in Afghanistan and city blocks in Iraq would someday put a premium on everything the M14 had been retired for having too much of. The rifle wasn't ahead of its time when it was designed, and it wasn't secretly perfect all along. It just happened to hold on to a set of qualities that stopped mattering for a few decades and then mattered again, right when a new generation of soldiers needed exactly what it had never stopped being able to do. That's the real story behind the American M14. It never beat the M16 at being a general-purpose infantry rifle, and it was never going to. It survived because no newer rifle managed to fully retire the specific job it did better than anything else in the inventory. Hitting hard, hitting far, and doing it with a round the battlefield eventually demanded again, whether anyone had planned for that demand or not. Sometimes the weapon that loses the argument on paper is the one still standing when the terms of the argument change out from under everyone who thought the debate was already settled. If you want more stories about American weapons that got a second life doing a job nobody expected them to do again, subscribe to Warfare Unclassified. And let us know in the comments which retired weapon you want us to make the case for next.